I can't get number. Jack Pearson stared at his reflection in the grimy bathroom mirror of the run-down motel room. The flickering fluorescent light cast a sickly pallor over his stubbled face, accentuating the dark circles under his eyes. He splashed cold water on his face, hoping to wash away the weariness that had seeped into his bones, but it was no use. The dissatisfaction gnawing at him for months now felt like a physical presence, a weight pressing down his shoulders. At 32, Jack should have been at the prime of his life. He had a decent job as a mid-level marketing executive, a comfortable apartment in the city, and a long-term girlfriend who had been dropping not-so-subtle hints about marriage. On paper, his life looked good. But the paper couldn't capture the restlessness that had taken root in his soul, the nagging feeling that there had to be more to life than this. He left the bathroom and flopped onto the lumpy bed, grabbing the remote and flicking through the channels. Nothing held his attention for more than a few seconds. Ads flashed by, each promising happiness, fulfillment, and satisfaction if only he'd buy this car, wear those clothes, or drink that beer. Jack snorted. He tried it all, but none had filled the void. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Lisa, his girlfriend, probably wondering why he hadn't come home last night. He let it go to voicemail. What could he say to her? That he'd driven for hours, without a destination, ending up in this seedy motel in the middle of nowhere. That he was suffocating in the life they'd built together. Jack's mind drifted back to his college days, when he'd been full of dreams and ambitions. He'd wanted to be a musician then, spending nights writing songs and playing small gigs with his band. But practicality had won out. He traded his guitar for a briefcase, his dreams for a steady paycheck. And now, a decade later, he found himself lying in a stranger's bed, running from a life that no longer felt like his own. He closed his eyes, remembering the rush he used to feel on stage, the way the music would flow through him, connecting him to something larger than himself. When was the last time he'd felt genuinely alive like that? With a sudden burst of energy, Jack sat up and grabbed his laptop. He opened a new document and began to type, pouring out all the frustrations and disappointments that had been building up inside him. It wasn't music, but it was something. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of, not quite satisfaction, but a possibility. As the sun rose, casting a pale light through the thin curtains, Jack finally fell into a fitful sleep, his laptop still open beside him. The constant beeping of his phone alarm jolted Jack awake. He blinked, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night came rushing back, along with a fresh wave of anxiety. He had meetings scheduled all day, clients to alleviate and reports to file. The thought of going through another day of meaningless tasks made his stomach churn. But as he reached for his phone to silence the alarm, his eyes fell on the laptop. The document he'd started last night was still open, the cursor blinking at the end of a page filled with raw, honest words. Jack began to read, surprised by the intensity of the emotions he'd poured onto the virtual page. He was tempted to delete it all for a moment, to pretend this moment of vulnerability had never happened. But something stopped him. Instead, he saved the document and closed the laptop. He couldn't ignore the truth of what he'd written, even if he wasn't sure what to do with it yet. Jack showered quickly, put on yesterday's rumpled clothes and checked out of the motel. As he drove back to the city, he felt a strange mix of dread and anticipation. He knew he couldn't go on like this, pretending everything was fine when he felt utterly unfulfilled. But what was the alternative? He arrived at the office, just in time for his first meeting. As he sat through presentations and discussions, nodding and making appropriate noises, his mind kept reverting to the words he'd written. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding change. "Jack? Jack, are you with us?" He snapped to attention, realizing his boss had asked him a question. "Sorry, could you repeat that?" His boss frowned, clearly annoyed. "I asked if you could have the report on the Johnson account ready by the end of the day." Jack opened his mouth to say yes, to fall back into the pattern of agreeing to everything, of being the reliable yes man. But the words stuck in his throat. "Actually," he heard himself say, "I don't think I can." A hush fell over the room. His boss's frown deepened. "Excuse me," I said, "I can't have the report ready by the end of the day." "In fact," Jack continued, his heart pounding but his voice steady, "I don't think I can do this job anymore." Before anyone could respond, Jack stood up and walked out of the conference room. He went to his desk, grabbed his items, and left the building. He half expected security to stop him, but no one did. It was as if the universe was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do next. Jack drove home in a daze, his mind racing. What had he just done? Years of building a career are gone in an instant. But mixed with the panic was an unfamiliar feeling of lightness, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. When he got home, Lisa was waiting for him, worry etched on her face. "Jack, where have you been? I've been calling you all night." He looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in months. She was beautiful, and kind, and everything he should have wanted. But the distance between them felt insurmountable. "Lisa," he said softly, "we need to talk." The conversation that followed was long and painful. There were tears, recriminations, moments of tenderness and regret. But in the end, they both knew it was over. The life they'd been building together was a facade, and it was crumbling. As Lisa packed her things, Jack opened his laptop at his desk. He reread what he'd written the night before, and then began to type again. He wrote about the end of his job, his relationship, and the fear and exhilaration of stepping into the unknown. Days passed. Jack barely left his apartment, surviving on food and coffee deliveries. He wrote constantly, filling page after page with his thoughts, memories, hopes, and fears. It wasn't until his landlord came knocking, demanding the rent, that Jack realized how much time had passed. He looked around his apartment, at the life he'd accumulated over the years. Designer clothes he'd never felt comfortable in, gadgets he'd barely used, souvenirs from vacations that had left him feeling empty. None of it mattered anymore. Jack made a decision. He packed a small bag with essentials, grabbed his laptop, and left his apartment for the last time. He had some savings to keep him going if he was careful. It was time to find out who he was and what he wanted. He bought a used car that was not flashy, but reliable enough for a long journey. Jack felt terror and exhilaration as he drove out of the city, watching the skyscrapers recede in his rearview mirror. He had no plan, no destination in mind. For the first time in his adult life, he was truly free. Jack drove for days, stopping in small towns and cities he'd never heard of. He talked to strangers in diners and bars, listening to their stories and sharing bits of his own. And every night he wrote. Sometimes it was just a few lines, other times he'd write for hours, losing himself in the flow of words. One evening, about a month into his journey, Jack found himself in a small college town. He was sitting in a coffee shop, working on his writing, when he overheard a conversation at the following table. A group of students discussed an open mic night at a local bar. Almost without thinking, Jack packed up his things and followed them. He hadn't played music in years, but suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to perform. He borrowed a guitar from one of the regulars and signed up for a slot. When it was his turn, Jack stepped onto the small stage, his heart pounding. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. The song was rough, unpolished, different from the polished pop tunes he'd written in college. But it was raw and honest, filled with all the frustration and longing he'd been carrying for so long. As he played, something shifted inside him. The restlessness that had driven him for so long began to quiet. He opened his eyes and saw the audience watching him intently, some nodding along, others closing their eyes, lost in the music. When the song ended, there was a moment of silence before the applause started. It wasn't thunderous, this wasn't a stadium concert, but it was genuine. People approached him afterwards, telling him how his song resonated with them and asking if he had any recordings. Jack left the bar that night with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He knew he wouldn't become a rock star, that dream belonged to a different version of himself. But he had found something real, something that satisfied a need he'd almost forgotten he had. Jack continued his journey over the next few months. He had a different focus. He sought open mics and small venues, performing his songs and refining his craft. He started a blog, sharing his writing and music with a growing online audience. It wasn't fame or fortune, but authentic and deeply satisfying. 1 year to the day after he'd walked out of his office, Jack found himself back in his hometown. He parked his car and walked to the park where he used to play as a kid. Sitting on a bench, he pulled out his laptop and began to write. He wrote about the journey he'd been on, both physical and emotional. He wrote about the people he'd met, the places he'd seen, the lessons he'd learned. And as he wrote, he realized something profound. The satisfaction he'd been chasing for so long wasn't a destination to be reached, but a way of living. Jack closed his laptop and looked at the familiar landscape of his childhood. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. The restlessness hadn't disappeared entirely. He suspected it never would, but it no longer controlled him. He had found a way to channel it into something meaningful that felt true to him. As the sun began to set, Jack stood up and stretched. He didn't know the future, but was no longer afraid of it. He had his writing, music, and a newfound understanding of himself. It could have been better or more accessible, but it was real. And for Jack, that was enough. He walked back to his car, humming a new tune under his breath. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time in his life, Jack felt like he was on the right path, not running towards some elusive idea of satisfaction, but embracing life's complex, imperfect, beautiful reality. And in that moment, it was all he needed.